It was a late Friday evening, and I was sitting in my office, reviewing a list of candidates for a new vacancy that had just opened up. As the regional director of a chemical company specializing in eco-friendly products for soil management, I had a lot on my plate. Our products were used by farmers to manage fertilizers and water containment, which helped keep our food supply sustainable. We were proud to be pioneers in providing environmentally safe solutions in an industry that didn't always prioritize that. 2 of my office staff were leaving soon, both because their spouses had been promoted and were moving out of state. This meant they had to resign within the next few months, so we were moving fast to fill their positions. Our sales team worked across 8 states in the Midwest, and this year we exceeded our targets, which was a huge milestone for us. Ruby, my executive assistant, peeked into my office to give me the update I was waiting for. Stanley, all 8 candidates confirmed their interviews for Monday. "I'm heading out for the night," she said with a small wave as she left. Every Thursday, I traveled to different states within my region to lead a sales meeting, which usually took half a day. By Friday evening, I'd be on my way back home. My wife, Mallory, took advantage of these nights to spend time with her friends, though over the years, we had racked up quite the babysitting bill. These trips allowed me to meet face-to-face with our sales reps, helping them improve their performance and solve any issues. It was an investment that paid off since we hadn't had a single resignation in 8 years, something almost unheard of in this industry. I had just gotten back to the office in time to finish up some final tasks before heading home. The company had tried to convince me to delegate these sales trips to someone else, but I valued the quiet time they provided. Between Mallory, who was always in the know about everything, and our 3 kids, those peaceful hours on the road were a rare chance for reflection. Plus, keeping the company's budget in check was important to me, and these trips saved the cost of hiring a sales manager. Our oldest, Bolivia, was getting ready to graduate and head to the university in the fall on a full scholarship, which was a huge relief financially. Our youngest, Sophie, was 16 and studying for her learner's permit. We were in a good spot as a family. Mallory and I had been married for 20 years, and she worked as the executive assistant for the district attorney. The DA had just accepted a high-paying job with the federal government, and though he was about my age, he had never settled down. There were always rumors, but I never believed them. For the last 15 years, my parents had graciously taken our kids every second weekend of the month, giving Mallory and me some much-needed time to reconnect. That gesture probably saved our marriage at a time when we really needed it. With Olivia set to intern at a senator's office in Washington this summer, that chapter was winding down, but it had made a big difference for us over the years. Not long ago, my dad decided to buy ancestry kits for all 3 of our kids. With my approval, we sent them off, curious to see if any long-lost relatives would pop up. Bolivia thought it would be fun to keep the results a secret from her mom until they arrived, knowing it might take 5 or 6 months. This weekend, Mallory had planned a trip to Memphis for us to see a concert at the Orpheum, and we'd be back by Sunday. She always found ways to add special memories to our time together. I met Mallory during my senior year of college, but it wasn't a meet-cute kind of story. I was a vendor at one of our school's football games, selling snacks to the crowd. Mallory's dad was part of the medical team for the football team, so she always had free tickets. That day she was there with a date, and they got into a fight over something trivial. Things escalated, and as she pushed her date away, he stumbled into me, sending me and my tray of snacks flying down the concrete stairs. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed with my head wrapped in bandages. The doctor informed me that I had 25 stitches across my forehead from a deep cut. Mallory visited me daily, weighed down by guilt. During my week-long coma, caused by internal injuries, she even met my entire family. When I started to come around, I saw what I thought was some kind of ethereal figure, almost like an angel standing by my side. It took me a moment to realize it wasn't a vision of the afterlife, but actually Mallory. Beside her stood my then-girlfriend, Lindsay. I remember feeling confused, and to be honest, a bit disappointed to see her there. I drifted in and out of consciousness, and when I finally woke up, Lindsay was gone. In her place was Mallory, who stuck by me as I recovered. Our relationship slowly grew after that, even though we never really made it official. 3 months later, we were married. I'll never forget how stunning she looked walking down the aisle. 5 feet 8 inches, long blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, and a figure that turned heads. By our 5th anniversary, though, things weren't going so smoothly. We hit a rough patch, and for a while, we even considered going our separate ways, but somehow we managed to stick together. One day, after leaving a popular restaurant called Charlie's Bar and Grill, famous for tossing bread rolls across the room, we found ourselves having a heavy conversation. The food was nothing to write home about, but the place reminded Mallory of her mom's cooking. So we made a stop. On the drive home, Mallory brought up something that threw me off completely. She started talking about infidelity, suggesting that maybe I should consider having an affair. She went on to say that marriage norms were changing and that it might actually help us understand each other better. I was stunned, to say the least. Her suggestion didn't sit right with me at all. It seemed selfish and manipulative, like she was giving me permission to hurt someone else for our own benefit. I couldn't hold back anymore and ask her, "Why on earth would you want me to cheat? Did I do something so bad that you're hoping this ends our marriage?" The car fell into a long, uncomfortable silence. Mallory was always quick to respond, but this time she didn't say a word. After a few minutes, I turned the music back on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was going on. About an hour later, we were still on the road, about 40 miles from home. She turned the music off again and apologized, saying, "Stanley, I'm sorry. I think I've just been reading too many of those ridiculous romance novels. I don't know what I was thinking." Then she switched the music back on like everything was fine. But the thing is, our kids and I all knew she hated those books. They had been her mother's guilty pleasure, but Mallory had always dismissed them as trashy and beneath her. She couldn't stand them, so her explanation didn't make sense at all. As we neared home, I realized there was one part of her life I had never really questioned: her Thursday nights out with her friends. It had always seemed harmless. On the rare occasions I was home on Thursdays, she'd skip the outing to be with me. But now, after that strange conversation, I found myself wondering if something more was happening. Was she going out to bars with her friends? Was she involved in something questionable? By the time we pulled into the driveway, I was resolved to get to the bottom of it. Later that night, after we had settled in, I spent some time with my parents. They mentioned they wanted to talk to me privately the next day and hinted they were concerned about Mallory and our youngest daughter, Sophie. I wasn't sure what they meant, but I agreed to meet them around 3 o'clock after I finished my work interviews. The next morning, I let Mallory know I'd be heading to my parents' place in the afternoon. I told her we might be eating dinner a bit later, and she seemed fine with it. When my parents arrived, we gathered in my office, and after some small talk, my dad got right to the point. "Stanley, I really regret sending in those ancestry kits for the grandkids. We got a match. Sophie has a grandmother on her father's side who's been searching for her son and his descendants." With that, he handed me a form from Ancestry.com. It showed a woman's name and phone number. My heart sank. I could see from the look on my dad's face that he knew what this meant. "Dad, I don't think this is a mistake," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's see what we can find out." I grabbed the office phone and dialed the number on the form. I put the call on speaker and started recording it, wanting to make sure we had a record of whatever happened next. After a couple of rings, a woman answered. "This is Stanley Spencer. I'm looking for Sylvia Tate regarding a DNA match through Ancestry.com. I explained. "You're speaking to her," came the reply. "What can I help you with?" I hesitated for a second, then said, "Well, it's complicated, but I just learned that my youngest daughter, Sophie, is your granddaughter." "Are you talking about Sophie Spencer?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. "Yes," I confirmed. "Then perhaps you know my son, whom I had to give up for adoption when I was 15. Mrs. Tate continued. "I might, if I knew his name," I responded. "He was adopted by a family with the last name Harper. His given name was Andrew," Mrs. Tate revealed. My heart dropped. My parents, and I recognized the name instantly, and her confession was like a nightmare unfolding before me. "He's alive and well," I said, still in shock. "He's the district attorney here in Butler County, and he's also my wife's boss. Now it all makes sense why he never married. He's my only child," Mrs. Tate confessed. "I'm fighting stage 4 lung cancer and don't have much time left. Would you let Sophie visit me before I pass away? I'll cover any expenses. I just want to meet her and pass my estate on to her. Given the situation, I'll let my parents handle the coordination. They'll arrange for her to visit this weekend." I agreed, but I couldn't allow Sophie to travel alone. "Is there anything else you need? Please provide a notary statement for my lawyer to conduct a DNA test," Mrs. Tate requested. "He'll want to verify her identity before changing my will, considering the size of the inheritance." "No problem," I assured her. "I'll pass the call to my dad, and he'll handle the details." Exiting my office, I handed Ruby, my executive assistant, the personal recorder, to transcribe and notarize both my conversation and the phone call. "This is essential for the divorce proceedings. Should I prepare the authorization for the DNA test as well?" Ruby asked, showing her sharp understanding of the gravity of the situation. "Yes, please," I replied, "but keep it quiet for now. I need a few weeks to investigate my soon-to-be ex-wife's Thursday night activities." I then turned to my assistant, Mark. "I'll need your and your wife's help with a personal matter," I said, signaling how serious things had become. "My wife, Sadie, is almost done with her dispatch for the day. I'll text her to come over immediately," Mark responded, sensing the weight of the situation. Back in my office, we worked out the details. Mark and Sadie would use the spare key they have for my house to pack some clothes for Sophie next Friday. I'd pull her out of school and drop her off at their place by 10 a.m. After seeing my parents off, Sadie arrived. I directed her to Mark's office and joined them shortly. Meanwhile, Ruby had already transcribed the documents and made the necessary copies. I handed Mark and Sadie a copy of the conversation I'd had with my wife. I gave Ruby the paperwork my dad had provided and instructed her to make additional copies for the lawyer. Mark and Sadie were close friends, deeply affected by what I was going through. Sadie had grown up as neighbors with Mallory, and the truth about my wife's actions left them both stunned. We brainstormed ways to uncover more, and I suggested a plan. Mark would use my company car for sales trips, while Sadie would take Mark's car, pretending to cross-train for the next few months. Meanwhile, I'd discreetly follow Mallory on Thursday nights to gather evidence. My suspicions were growing, especially after Mallory had suggested I have an affair. I was beginning to believe she was plotting to run off with Andrew Harper, and this affair could justify her seeking a divorce. Sadie agreed, and even suggested getting the police involved to collect detailed evidence. She had a contact who could help. Later, Ruby updated us on George Thompson's departure from the district attorney's office and his move to practice. Sadie asked me to give George her regards when I visited him. We devised a plan to gather more information. Then I headed to meet George. He was a lawyer known for his involvement in the women's rights movement, challenging major legal precedents. His unconventional approach was making waves in the legal community. As we spoke, things began to click. My marital problems with Mallory had started right around the time she began working under Andrew Harper, which also coincided with my promotion and increased travel for work. If they were indeed having an affair every Thursday, then I had been blind to this deception for over 15 years. The expensive gifts Andrew had given Mallory now seemed much more suspicious. When I arrived, George was ready. Sadie had briefed him on everything. He handed me access codes to Andrew Harper's house and told me the alarm code as well. He even provided a phone number that would connect me to a team of professionals who could help discreetly. George, having grown up in tough neighborhoods, still had connections for getting things done quietly. The access codes he provided would remain valid until the end of the week, at which point Andrew would be reminded to change them. George had also come up with a strategy to sue Andrew for child support, dating back to Sophie's birth. It could potentially bankrupt him under state law. He suggested I temporarily transfer parental authority of Sophie to my parents until the court proceedings were over, to avoid any claims of manipulation. When I offered to pay George up front, he refused, saying it would tip Mallory off. Instead, he asked for a check that could be cashed once the legal proceedings began. I left feeling reassured that George had my best interests at heart. I finalized all the paperwork granting my parents temporary parental rights over Sophie, starting on Friday. They agreed it was the best course of action after George and I explained everything. Later, Sadie pulled up in her 2002 Ford Taurus. Since Mark was on his first sales trip, she left her car with me and took Mark's home. My eldest, Bolivia, texted me to say Mallory wasn't coming home for dinner. She was going straight out with her friends. Once Sadie arrived, we swapped cars, and I packed my suitcase. "Stanley," Sadie said, "the team's ready. Just tell me where to go." "Thanks," I replied. "George wants me to call them when it's time so he can serve them personally." I couldn't help but wonder about George's personal grudge against Andrew. "He's all about principles," Sadie explained. "Andrew is known for not keeping his promises." Later that night, I watched as Mallory and Andrew left their offices in separate cars, meeting up for dinner at Charlie's Bar and Grill. Afterward, they went their separate ways again. I followed Andrew home, positioning myself where I could see his house without being noticed. Mallory arrived first, using the alarm code to disable the system and enter. Moments later, Andrew pulled up, and they greeted each other with a passionate embrace at the door. I stopped recording as they disappeared inside. George's team had wired 6 rooms in Andrew's house with audio and video, courtesy of a neighbor's son who was serving time but still had connections. Everything was streamed live on a private page, providing irrefutable evidence of their affair. Around midnight, my daughter Olivia called in distress. "Mom's not home, and she's not answering her phone," she said. I told her to call Andrew and insist he put Mallory on the phone. "Why him?" Olivia asked, confused. "Because he's been her Thursday night companion for over 16 years, I revealed, sending her a clip of Mallory's encounter with the police earlier that evening. Olivia quickly realized her mother's betrayal. After sending Olivia the clip, I asked her to open the front door as I was returning to confront Mallory. Meanwhile, George called to inform me that he had served restraining orders on both Mallory and Andrew, barring them from coming near us. As I pulled into the driveway, Olivia opened the garage so I could park Sadie's car inside. "Olivia," I said, "remember the locksmith who changed the locks? It was part of the plan, prompted by the DNA test results, which revealed Sophie's biological connection to Andrew Harper." Olivia was visibly shaken, and I held her close until she regained her composure. We then retreated to the kitchen for privacy, where I played her the recording of the conversation Mallory and I had during our drive home from Memphis. It gave her a first-hand understanding of her mother's manipulative behavior. "Why would Mom encourage you to cheat?" Olivia asked, tears in her eyes. "To divert attention from her own actions, in case they were ever exposed," I answered. Ironically, her suggestion led to the truth coming out. Before we could continue, there was a knock at the door. A police officer stood there, informing us they had intercepted a taxi carrying Mallory. She had been warned about violating the restraining order and was forced to turn back. That night, Olivia and I talked at length. She was stunned that her mother had been having an affair for over 16 years. "How didn't we see it sooner?" she asked, struggling to process it all. I explained that it was easy to miss, given how busy our lives had been. The kids were young, I traveled often, and I trusted Mallory completely. Olivia nodded, realizing how deeply Mallory had manipulated us all. I was stunned. Olivia pointed out the most painful part, that her mother, Mallory, had used the trust we all placed in her to maintain her affair. As Olivia went to make coffee, I noticed the first signs of dawn peeking through the windows. Just then, I received a text from Mallory, urgently asking to talk about something related to our eldest child, Olivia, before I got back from my trip. Deciding how to respond, I reassured Olivia, then replied to Mallory's message. I declined her attempt at manipulation, telling her she could continue her plans with Andrew Harper, but without the kids. I explained to Olivia that her mother had suggested I have an affair, not to repair our marriage, but to use it against me in divorce court. Mallory had never expected to be caught after all these years. I could see how hard it was for Olivia to hear the truth. People often find it hard to accept painful realities, but eventually, they come to terms with them. I held my daughter as she cried once more. We had just managed to calm her down when my other children, Elliot and Sophie, woke up. I switched on the kitchen TV, intending to catch the morning news, and soon they joined us for breakfast. Everyone was surprised to see me at home. Then, to our shock, an image of Mallory flashed on the screen. My son turned up the volume. My heart broke for my kids as they listened to their mother and Andrew, laughing and mocking me, calling me foolish and clueless. My wife made a sarcastic comment about me, which caused both of them to burst into laughter. The reporter, however, interjected, saying they probably weren't laughing anymore after their scheme to set me up with an escort had backfired. The scene shifted to show George Thompson serving lawsuits to both Mallory and Andrew. The reporter provided details, and my daughter, Sophie, broke down into tears, running over to sit on my lap. It was then, in a harsh way, that she learned Andrew, her biological father, was not her dad, but her mother's longtime companion. Elliot summed it up well, asking, "What does your mother's attitude toward me say about how she feels about the rest of us?" Once Sophie had calmed down, Olivia and I explained what had happened since Mallory and I had returned from Memphis. I arranged for them to be excused from school on Friday and Monday, giving them time to process everything. Just as we were about to start eating breakfast, Sophie interrupted, exclaiming that the police chief was on the news. We turned up the volume again. The chief publicly announced that both Mallory Spencer and Andrew Harper, our district attorney, were under criminal investigation. A special team from outside the county had been brought in to lead the inquiry. I reflected on how quickly private actions can become public scandals and how society tends to be unforgiving when people like Mallory and Andrew are exposed. After breakfast, I asked the kids to sit down at the table. I showed each of them a copy of the letter my dad had received from the Ancestry DNA match. Then I said to Sophie, "Your grandparents are going to pick you up so you can meet your biological grandmother. She's very sick and is requesting to see you. There's an important reason for the meeting, but I think it's best that she explains it herself." I added, "As far as I'm concerned, you are and always will be my daughter. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your grandparents." I then asked Olivia to help Sophie pack for the weekend while I called my parents. Once the girls left, Elliot turned to me and asked, "How are you holding up, Dad?" "I'm struggling," I admitted, "but I'm doing my best to stay composed. Remember, son, if you're ever in this situation as a father, you have to stay strong for the people depending on you." With that, I called my parents to explain what was happening. They said they would come over as soon as they were done packing their car. They still had about an hour before they needed to leave for their flight. At that moment, something shifted in my relationship with Elliot, for the better. We were more connected than we had ever been before. The three of us watched as Sophie, the daughter I had raised, left with my parents to meet her biological grandmother for the first time. I prayed that things would go smoothly and that Sophie would still see me as her father when she returned. Meanwhile, over at the district attorney's office, the atmosphere was tense. Mallory had gone out to buy new clothes after having her car towed and the tires replaced. Andrew was busy reviewing the lawsuit George had served him. Though they didn't have a direct DNA sample, The biological connection to Sophie was undeniable, and Andrew couldn't refute it. The truth about their relationship and the fact that Andrew was Sophie's biological father had become common knowledge. It was turning into a political nightmare for both of them. Fraud, under the law, now included failure to disclose key facts, and George had used this to sue both Mallory and Andrew in a civil suit. It was clear that the two of them had been deceiving me for years. Even though several lawyers believed George and I had a strong case, no one was willing to get involved, likely because of George's fearsome reputation in court. The exposure of their behavior on Facebook, including their plan to ruin my life, had become headline news, especially considering my standing in the community. Mallory, who had frequented a nearby clothing store for years, never expected to be confronted there. A woman accused her of being unstable, saying she should have seen the consequences of her actions coming. The woman was referring to the compromising photos of Mallory that had surfaced on Facebook. Later, when Mallory returned to Andrew's house, she noticed the company wrapping up a service call. Assuming they thought she was the homeowner, they suggested resetting the security codes. It wasn't until later that she realized there had been no electronic signature verification. Mallory called Andrew, asking him who might be trying to sabotage his new position in St. Louis, and she filled him in on what she had discovered. They both suspected that this was about more than just me protecting myself. There were likely political motivations involved. As Mallory made herself some coffee, she reviewed the divorce petition I had filed. It stung her to realize that her own words had led me to become suspicious. Her suggestion that I damage others' lives had given me the clues I needed. On top of that, the DNA match from Ancestry.com had exposed the truth about Sophie's parentage, threatening to tear apart our family long before Sophie was even born. She realized I had orchestrated the events of the previous night, revealing all the hidden truths about her life. As she took another sip of coffee, the doorbell rang. When she answered it, she found Mr. Harrison, the neighbor Andrew disliked. "Mr. Harrison," she greeted, "what can I do for you?" Handing her a legal envelope, he explained, "Stanley used my place as a base for everything last night after Andrew Harper got my son sentenced to the maximum. The information in this envelope will be shared with the rest of your family today as well. Stanley asked me to find out if you're still laughing at him." Mallory took the envelope back to the kitchen and opened it. Inside were incriminating photos, images of her entering Andrew's house with her key, greeting him at the door, and engaging in intimate activities, all captured on camera. It also included footage of her confrontation with the police. The final document was a signed letter from me, revealing the potential public fallout that could severely damage her future. By the time I returned from Memphis, the letter read, "It was clear you were planning our divorce. I spent days trying to understand what made your affection for me turn into such animosity. I now realize that you blame me for what you see as the failings in your life, especially during the time when we had only 2 children. You felt trapped in our marriage, longing for your carefree single days. That's why you turned to another man, to relive the freedom you once had. You allowed Andrew to whisk you away from the life you despised for a few hours each week. You remained in the marriage not because you loved me, but because Andrew didn't want the responsibility of raising children, not even his own. You couldn't leave the kids with a man you saw as unsuitable, so you stayed, living a life for years. Every time you and Andrew avoided the consequences of your actions, your hatred for me grew. How much did you two laugh at my expense? Did belittling me make Andrew love you more? What I cannot forgive," I wrote, "is the message you and Andrew have sent to our children. It will shape their lives forever. I've yet to fully understand how much amusement you both got from manipulating me and using our children like pawns on a chessboard." I concluded. The KVOX news reporter summed it up perfectly. "Are you still laughing at Stanley Spencer? I watched Olivia, Elliot, and Sophie as they heard you mock me on live TV, and it broke my heart. Our son Elliot said it best, 'If you see me as worthless, what does that say about how you see them?'" The letter ended with, You've made sure our children's relationship with you is non-existent. But at least you and Andrew can enjoy branding me a fool forever." Mallory's hands shook so violently as she read the letter that she dropped the papers. She was consumed with bitterness, showing no care for me, our children, or anyone else. She was selfish and driven by her own desires. Tears welled up in her eyes. I had a way of calling out people's flaws without openly condemning them, and my words had hit her hard. I saw her actions for what they were, efforts to preserve her own lifestyle, not motivated by love. I also realized that Andrew had likely been pressuring her to leave me and the kids long before Sophie's birth, but his new job had forced them to rush their plans. By now, Mallory wasn't laughing anymore. She knew that I had exposed their actions for what they were, and she would have to face the fallout. It felt like a declaration of war. If Andrew Harper went down, he intended to drag everyone with him. Mallory continued reading the divorce petition, and I could tell it was tearing her apart. One of the lawsuits accused them of fraud for hiding Sophie's true parentage. The potential financial damage sickened her. If I won the case, both she and Andrew would face financial devastation. Mallory and Andrew had both severely underestimated me, assuming I was the fool they had always believed me to be. Saturday turned into pure chaos for my two eldest children and me. From early morning until about 4 in the afternoon, family members kept showing up. Mallory's parents, her 2 brothers, 1 sister, and their spouses all came by to offer support. Each brought one of their favorite dishes, making sure we had plenty to eat. Even my brother and sister came in from out of town to check on us. Despite everything, we were surrounded by love and care. Each visitor struggled to understand how Mallory could have hidden her betrayal for so long. They all agreed that the evidence from social media was clear. She was trying to destroy me, driven by hatred. At one point, my father-in-law and I stepped out to the back deck. He encouraged me to let go of whatever was weighing me down, assuring me that he would keep others away until I felt better. He stayed with me until I calmed down, mentioning that he planned to revise his will. He intended to redistribute Mallory's share to my 3 children. He couldn't forgive Mallory for what she had become. Later, I got a call from my dad, letting me know that Sophie had met with Mrs. Tate and that their meeting had gone well. Mrs. Tate had been kind and understanding, helping Sophie open up about her feelings. The lawyer got the necessary blood sample and had a private conversation with my father. They talked about Andrew Harper, and my dad shared what we knew. It turned out that Andrew's biological father was serving a life sentence for a major crime, and Sophie's arrival had complicated his inheritance. I reassured my father that George Thompson had taken legal steps to keep Andrew away from us. That day was filled with visits from family on both sides, all offering their support. My parents were staying at Mrs. Tate's estate, where Sophie was spending the weekend. They liked Mrs. Tate and mentioned how seeing Sophie had brought a smile to her face after a long time. My mom spoke with Mrs. Tate, who expressed gratitude for how we were handling everything. Mrs. Tate planned to leave everything in a trust for Sophie, which I would manage until she turned 25. Before we ended the call, I asked my parents to text me when they were on their way home with Sophie so I could be there when she arrived. I sent a message to Sophie, telling her that we all missed her and loved her. Finally, we had a moment to tidy up the house before Mark and Sadie arrived with my car. I apologized to Sadie for forgetting to return it. Sadie mentioned that the police chief saw an opportunity to take down Andrew Harper and that he and George were working together. George had provided some questionable evidence to help the investigators. Mark said that the atmosphere at the office was tense and many people were upset. He told me that some of the staff had known about the situation for most of the week and were offering support where they could. I reflected on how it had been an emotional roller coaster since Thursday night. The kids were still struggling at times, so I decided I'd take Monday off as well. Sadie asked if I had heard from Mallory, and I replied that I hadn't since Thursday night. I guessed that she and Andrew were busy moving on with their lives, having made it clear how they saw us in public. Early Sunday morning, My youngest daughter called to ask if it was okay for her and her grandparents to return late on Monday. I agreed, provided it was fine with her grandparents. She thanked me for insisting she go and explained that Mrs. Tate had helped her come to terms with the fact that it wasn't her fault. Her mother's affair had brought her into the world. Before hanging up, she told me she loved me. On Monday evening, Olivia, Elliot, and I stood by as my parents pulled into the driveway. They looked worn out from the weekend. As soon as my mom got out of the car, she rushed into my arms. It was such a relief to have my youngest daughter back home. My dad opened the trunk and brought in Sophie's suitcase, which Elliot took up to her room. The three of them sat down in the family room to catch up, and Sophie shared stories about meeting her new grandmother. Meanwhile, my parents and I retreated to the kitchen. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee while they shared their thoughts on Mrs. Sylvia Tate. She seemed at peace when we left, my dad remarked. It was like meeting Sophie had brought her some closure, and she was ready for what's coming. My mom pulled a legal-sized envelope from her purse and handed it to me. Mrs. Tate's lawyer had given this to me, per her instructions, she said. I opened the envelope and found a letter along with a check for $50,000. The letter was brief and to the point. Mrs. Tate thanked me for honoring her request and mentioned how she had lived longer than expected since our first contact. She confirmed the DNA connection and commended me for how I had raised Sophie. She asked me to use the funds to help my family get through the tough times we were facing and to stay true to my values. I let my parents read the letter, and we reflected on how we might have helped fulfill someone's dying wish. Over coffee, I filled them in on everything that had happened while they were away. I told them I believed the worst of the emotional storm was behind us and that we could finally start getting back to normal. Starting the next day, the rest of the week went relatively smoothly, all things considered. Mallory tried reaching out to each of our kids by phone, but they rejected her attempts to reconnect. Meanwhile, corporate headquarters was pleased that I had finally stepped away from managing the sales meetings, and they began searching for a new sales manager, something they hadn't done in over a decade. As I sat in my office, reviewing the monthly sales figures, Ruby walked in, looking concerned. I asked what was wrong, and she explained that my recent letter to Mallory had been posted online in the opinion section of a regional Kansas newspaper. We quickly pulled up the site and found the letter. Ruby read it aloud, and I nodded, acknowledging that I had written it during a moment of emotional distress. I wondered if I had been too harsh. Ruby shook her head. "No, Stanley," she said firmly. "The letter just lays out the reality of Mallory's actions in a direct way. Either one of them could have ended the affair and come clean, but they didn't. Andrew enjoyed all the benefits without bearing any of the costs. We talked about how rare it is for people to see the fallout from someone's actions in such a public way. Ruby, having gone through her own divorce, said the letter served as a reminder of the pain people go through before finding peace. Then she pointed out a comment on the site from a longtime feminist, highlighting how Mallory and Andrew's actions had set back the movement for equality and empowerment. Later that night, Mallory and Andrew went to Charlie's Bar and Grill for dinner. It was a busy Friday, but they were surprised to find the place unusually empty. Vacant tables surrounded them. When they asked the waitress why it was so quiet, she explained that people were waiting, but they refused to be seated near them. Likely, most had read the letter I had written to Mallory, now posted on the newspaper's website. Feeling uncomfortable, they quickly asked for the check and left. As they exited the restaurant, Mallory spotted her parents at a nearby table, waiting for their meal. She walked over and greeted them, with Andrew trailing behind. Her father, without turning to face her, said coldly, "Mr. Harper, I suggest you take your companion and leave so my wife, and I can enjoy our meal in peace." Mallory left in tears, finally understanding that there was no going back. She would have to live with the consequences of her and Andrew's actions for the rest of her life. Back at Andrew's place, they checked the newspaper website and saw the public's overwhelming disapproval. Their actions had significantly shrunk their social circle. On another front, I sat in the passenger seat of my car, Watching as Sophie drove us to Wichita, Kansas, we had received news that her grandmother, Sylvia, had passed away, and we were heading to the airport to catch the private plane provided by her estate. Sophie was deeply affected, having grown close to her grandmother through their frequent phone calls. Olivia and Elliot had been incredibly supportive, bringing us all closer. They had even started urging me to start dating again, but I was hesitant. Once bitten, twice shy. Meanwhile, Andrew and Mallory had relocated to St. Louis. Andrew was allowed to start his new federal job early, as the county was eager to get rid of him. After paying over $45,000 in questionable expenses, they moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment, facing the reality of a potential bankruptcy due to the civil fraud lawsuit. Under Missouri bankruptcy laws, they were only allowed to keep $10,000 each in equity. Our divorce had been finalized under state law. Mallory was required to pay child support for our kids while they were still in school and cover 50% of their living expenses if they chose to live on campus. The civil trial for fraud was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks. My kids still refused to speak to their mother, and her side of the family had distanced themselves from her as well. She had learned the hard way that people only tolerate so much before they walk away for good. Sophie had been forced to attend a state-mandated meeting with her biological father, Andrew. It didn't go well. She told him, in front of the child services representatives, that both he and her mother were not important to her anymore. We attended her grandmother's funeral, and after the service, the lawyer revealed the substantial inheritance left to Sophie. Overwhelmed by the situation, Sophie and I decided to sell her grandmother's house and most of its contents, keeping only a few pieces of jewelry and some family photos that Sophie wanted. When we returned home, with the school year wrapping up, I began preparing for the first day of the fraud trial, set for Wednesday. As I was organizing some paperwork, Sophie entered the den. She asked if I could arrange a meeting with Andrew, Mallory, their lawyers, and George on Tuesday. She wanted them to fully understand the real cost of their actions, an idea inspired by her grandmother, Sylvia. I called George and set it up. On that bright, sunny Tuesday, we all sat down at the meeting. Sophie, standing strong, explained that she had called the meeting to address Andrew, her biological father. She handed him a sealed envelope containing information about his own father's location in prison and his request for Andrew to visit him. Sophie disclosed the details of her conception and revealed that her biological grandmother had left her over $1 million in a trust, managed by me until she turned 25. That inheritance would have been Andrew's if the truth hadn't been uncovered. She warned both Andrew and Mallory that the legal consequences could escalate if they didn't consider mediation before going to trial. As we left the meeting, I felt proud and humbled. My daughter had spoken her truth, and whatever the future held, I knew I had been given the real blessing. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.